Species formed in the past through the process of evolution. And this process is still going on today as new species are continually being formed. This lesson is on how species form. So, two species may appear very similar but be considered different species. So, this could be black bears and grizzly bears, or horses and donkeys. This is because of the definition of a species. So, a species are two organisms that can breed together and have fertile offspring. So, in the case of horses and donkeys, they can breed and they can produce an offspring, a mule, but that mule will be infertile. So, therefore, a horse and a donkey are not the same species. So, appearances can be deceiving in this situation. So, species can form because of reproductive isolation. And different species are reproductively isolated from one another. This could be due to a number of factors. So, the parts that they have, the places that they live, and the times that they breed. There are two general pathways that can lead to the creation of a new species. So, one is transformation. So, an existing species turns into a new species while that old species disappears. So that old former species, the ancestral species, will no longer exist, and a new species has taken its place. The second type of species formation is divergence. So one species becomes two different species. They could be two new species or one old and one new species. We see this when we look at wolves. So wolves became wolves and dogs over many generations. So divergence increases the biological diversity because it increases the number of species that exist. For speciation to occur, populations of the same species must be prevented from breeding with each other. So there must be some biological or geographical barrier that prevents that breeding. And then if those two populations are separated for a long enough time, changes that occur in those populations through natural selection can lead to those two new species. So when we look at the Galapagos Islands and the finches that Charles Darwin studied, because they were separated by ocean, being on different islands, there was a geographical barrier that prevented them from breeding with each other. So geographical barriers keep populations physically separated. They cannot come together to breed. They only need to be present long enough for speciation to occur. So they can be transient geographical barriers, but again, they must stay in place long enough for the two populations to become different species. So these could be oceans, whether small parts of oceans or large parts of oceans, like the entire Atlantic separating South America and Africa, or uh, the Pacific Ocean separating the different Hawaiian Islands. It could be mountains, such as the Rocky Mountains separating BC and Alberta. It could be an earthquake preventing ground dwelling species from getting from one side of the new gap to the other. Valleys, such as the Grand Canyon, that go for hundreds of kilometers, preventing species, again, ground dwelling species, from getting from one side to the other. Or even smaller ones, such as a river, which would, in essence, prevent species that can't swim or fly from getting from one side to the other again. So geographical boundaries don't need to be outlandishly large, but they just have to prevent organisms from getting across. Biological barriers occur between species that share the same range. So these are species that habit the same part of the earth but aren't able to breed. So examples may include breeding season. So this would prevent, say, plants from breeding with other plants of different species because they bloom at different times of the year, or reproductive parts, where one animal physically cannot reproduce with another animal. So speciation will occur in reproductively isolated populations. So a single founder species, so let's say Darwin's finches, can produce a number of different species in different locations. So there was a foundered species that then, because it had different islands, they produced a variety of different birds with different beak types and different colors because they weren't able to interbreed. So the offspring were reproductively isolated from the offspring on the other islands, and different variations were advantageous, so different species developed. Adaptive radiation is the diversification of a common ancestral species into a variety of differently adapted species. So again, here's the Galapagos finches. So as we go around the circle, we can see we had one common ancestor in the center, and it leads to all these different finches, some eating birds, some eating nuts, some eating cactus seeds, and some eating nuts and fruit. Adaptive radiation occurs when the original ancestors disperse. They encounter new environments on each of the different islands. Each of those different islands or locations might have slightly different selection pressures. If we're looking at a species such as grizzly bears, we have different selective pressures on the grizzly bears in Banff versus the grizzly bears in Yellowstone versus the grizzly bears in Yukon. They encounter different risks versus trains versus highways versus people versus garbage cans, and they all have different selective pressures. So adaptations that allow the organisms to survive in these new environments will eventually result in a new species. So, again, this is speciation through natural selection because the pressure has been put on those organisms through the environment. So, since Darwin's time, evolutionary biologists have suggested that evolution is very slow. So, we see large differences between species now are the sum of all the small changes over a long period of time. So, again, if we look at horses, zebras, donkeys, they have common ancestors, but there's been small changes over time that lead up to the large difference we see between those different species. However, occasionally we do see sudden changes in the fossil record that don't support the slow theory of evolution all the time. So there's also a theory of punctuated equilibrium. So punctuated equilibrium proposes that the evolutionary history consists of long periods where there's very little changes because the environment is stable. That's going to be broken up by rapid periods of change because the environment changed suddenly. So this theory proposes that when a species first diverges first diverges from a parent species, there's major morphological changes. So there's major changes in a short period of time because of a large change in the environment. So this can occur when a species enters a new area. So a species has been brought from one location to another, whether naturally or artificially. And then when this occurs, there's all of a sudden new selection pressures on that species that are going to select for different adaptations, resulting in the immediate next generation being very different from the parent generation. So a sudden environmental change that is an example of this is there's a moth. And in pre-industrialized England, this moth was mostly white because it was able to hide on aspen and poplar trees that have pretty white bark. But then post-industrialization, all of a sudden within a few years, there was a lot of coal dust in the air from steam engines and factories. So now the barks of the trees were covered in ash and coal dust. So within a very short period of time, the moths that used to be mostly white all of a sudden became mostly gray to still hide on those trees. And this would have occurred within a few generations because of the immediate change in selective pressure for the moths. So those white moths on those gray trees are immediately going to be smacked up by birds and squirrels and gophers and other um, predator species. So the moths that happened to be a little bit more gray were able to survive, pass on their genes to the next generation, leading to within several generations, which is a short period of time, so several years, mostly gray moths. So this graphic is showing the difference between gradualism, where we can see those slow gliding changes occurring over time, and the punctuated equilibrium, where we have those vertical lines where almost there's no changes, followed by very rapid changes where all of a sudden a new species has been formed. So, beginning to summarize the theory of evolution by natural selection, life forms have developed from ancestral species. Not all the same species and not all at once, but ancestral species created all the life forms that we see on Earth today. All living things are related to one another by varying degrees through common descent. So, if we think back to the kingdom, phylum, class order, we're mammals, so we're related to all mammals on a distant scale, but we're related to primates on a closer scale. All living things on Earth share a common origin or ancestor. So, at one point, there was only one oxygen breathing organism on Earth. And then all oxygen-breathing organisms are descended from that common ancestor. And lastly, the mechanisms by which one species evolves into another involves random heritable genetic mutation. So this could again be errors in copies of DNA or chance encounters with mutagens. Mutations that increase the chance of survival of an individual are most likely to be passed on to offspring. Over time, that successful mutation will spread throughout the population and cause changes within it. And then now, once all the individuals in a population or species have that mutation, it's now known as an adaptation. I hope you enjoyed learning about natural selection because I sure enjoyed sharing it with you.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website online.plrd.ab.ca and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.